He was 5'5", barely 110 pounds, the kind of boy recruiters laughed out of the room. In June 1942, he walked into a Marine Corps office with hope burning in his chest. The recruiter didn't even raise his head. "Come back when you've grown," he said. The Navy turned him down. The paratroopers told him he was a danger to his own parachute. The Army looked at his frame and called him a liability. They all saw the same thing, a frail farm boy who belonged behind a plow, not behind a rifle. What they didn't see was the weapon that poverty had built. In the cotton fields of Hunt County, Texas, Hunger was a stricter drill sergeant than any officer. By 16, Audie Murphy had already seen more failure than most men twice his age. His father drifted away. His mother's lungs gave out in the cold. Suddenly, 12 children were on their own, and Audie was the one standing between them and starvation. His only ally, a battered .22 rifle. His only mission, feed the family before nightfall. Each bullet was precious. Each shot had to matter. Neighbors would later recall a small, quiet boy who could hit a running rabbit at 50 yards with a gun that couldn't hit the side of a barn for anyone else. When they asked him how he did it, he answered flatly, "If I miss, my family doesn't eat." There was no romance in it, no training, no glory, just survival, the kind that carves instinct into the bone. That instinct would follow him into every battlefield of Europe. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, Murphy saw his chance. 3 meals a day, a steady paycheck, a way out of Texas, dust and desperation. He forged his age with his sister's help. The paper said 18, but the Mirror said 16. The Army clerk hesitated, then stamped it anyway. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. In basic training, the other recruits joked that he looked like a mascot. Drill sergeants called him Baby, until the rifle range. When the targets appeared, the jokes stopped. Murphy's eyes, pale blue, steady locked onto the sights. Each trigger pull snapped with mechanical rhythm. Every round hit dead center. He didn't blink. He didn't miss. The instructors exchanged glances. There was something unsettling about the way this kid fired, not aggressive, not emotional, just absolute precision, like hunger itself had taken human form. By the time his unit shipped out to the Mediterranean in 1943, Murphy wasn't chasing dreams of medals or glory. He was chasing one thing he'd never had control. He'd already lost his childhood, his parents, his peace. What could war possibly take that life hadn't already stripped away? The recruiters thought they'd enlisted a boy. They hadn't. They'd conscripted a survivor and turned him loose in a world built for killing. The transport ship pitched in the rough Mediterranean. Somewhere below deck, Private Audie Murphy sat cross-legged on his duffel, cleaning his rifle again and again, like a ritual. To the others, he was still the kid, 5'0", polite, quiet, unreadable. But inside him, something had already clicked. He'd been poor long enough to know what desperation could do. And now, the battlefield would see it too. July 1943, Sicily. The heat was thick, the hills dry and cruel. Company B advanced through vineyards and stone villages that hid German machine guns behind every wall. It was here that Murphy's first truth of war revealed itself. Fear makes most men freeze, but it made him focus. When his unit was pinned by an MG-42 cutting the trail in half, doctrine said to wait for armor. Murphy didn't wait. He crawled along a goat path, flanked the nest, and tossed 2 grenades into the dark mouth of the bunker. When the smoke cleared, he turned the captured weapon on the retreating line. The noise shook the hillside, one man, turning enemy steel against its makers. His captain wrote a commendation. Murphy just cleaned the barrel, expressionless. He'd learned the first rule of his own kind of warfare: speed over fear, precision over rage. By autumn, Salerno. Rain, mud, and the stench of death. He moved like an animal that belonged to the terrain, low, silent, economical. He didn't waste motion, didn't speak unless it mattered. Comrades began watching him the way hunters watch a predator they don't understand. He was 19 but already looked older, eyes sunk deep, jaw always tight. And yet, amid chaos, he was the calmest man in the line. A platoon sergeant once said, "Murphy didn't fight angry, that's what was terrifying. He fought cold. Every burst, every trigger squeeze, calculated. See a target, eliminate it, move on. No shouting, no adrenaline, just work." Then came Anzio, February 1944, a beachhead Churchill called the Wild Animals Cage. The ground was flat, the enemy artillery endless. When a German tank broke through the smoke, men scattered. Murphy didn't. He grabbed a bazooka, crawled forward until the tank filled his scope, and fired. The explosion lifted the turret clean off. He stood in the blast wind, face blank, then returned to his position as if nothing had happened. That earned him a Silver Star, the first of many. But the medal meant less than the moment. He had confirmed what the war was already whispering. He was built for this not by training, not by pride, but by survival itself. By summer, his name carried weight. Officers called him dependable. Men followed his lead without question. And yet, Murphy carried no swagger. He still wrote short letters home, signed them, "Your son, Audie." No poetry, no reflection, just fact, still alive, still fighting. The boy Texas forgot was now a man Europe feared, and the war was about to demand the impossible. Winter crept into Italy like a slow death. Mud froze into jagged stone, boots tore, fingers split. By early 1944, Audie Murphy was no longer the rookie everyone pitied. He was the man they wanted beside them when the shooting started. His squad joked that he had a sixth sense, that he could smell an ambush before it happened. But Murphy knew what it really was. Years of hunger had tuned him to the faintest signs of threat, a misplaced sound, a flicker of motion, the rhythm of silence before danger. It wasn't luck, it was evolution. July 1944. The push through southern France was chaos, narrow roads, sudden counterattacks, officers dying faster than replacements could arrive. Murphy's platoon moved along the Rhone Valley when the ambush hit. A wall of machine gun fire shredded the front of the column. Their lieutenant, the only man holding the map, dropped instantly. The radio operator went next. For a second, everyone froze. No orders, no leadership, no plan. Then Murphy shouted. It wasn't a heroic speech, just a single command that cut through the panic. Get cover, left flank, return fire. He didn't wait for permission. He crawled forward, through the dust and screams, and started directing fire by instinct, one man rebuilding order from the wreckage. By the time reinforcements arrived, the road was clear and the ambush destroyed. 18 Americans had held against a company-sized German unit. When they counted the bodies, Murphy had personally accounted for 15. It was the day he stopped being just a survivor and became a leader. A week later, his captain found him sitting alone, cleaning his rifle again. "Lieutenant's gone," the officer said quietly. "You're it now." Murphy blinked once. He wasn't surprised. The war didn't promote by age, it promoted by survival. By October, the paperwork made it official. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy. The boy who had forged a birth certificate to get into the Army now signed orders sending men into battle. Responsibility didn't inflate his pride, it crushed him a little more each day. Every name he wrote, he knew he might have to erase. He didn't talk about fear. He didn't talk much at all. But men followed him, because he never sent anyone where he wouldn't go himself. If the front was quiet, he scouted ahead. If it was loud, he was the first to rise and fire. Murphy learned that leadership in war wasn't about shouting or medals. It was about timing, knowing exactly when to break a rule to save lives. And that skill, born from instinct, would soon define him in the most impossible hour of the war. By the end of 1944, the Mediterranean campaign was fading behind him. He had survived Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and Rome. He'd been wounded twice, decorated 5 times, and buried more friends than he could remember. He looked 30, though he was barely 20. The Army called it experience. Murphy called it the cost of staying alive. Ahead waited France, the frozen Vosges Mountains, and a village named Holzweier, where the smallest soldier in Company B would make the biggest stand of the entire war. By January 1945, France was frozen in steel and silence. The Allied front had advanced through the Ardennes, but one corner of the map refused to fall, a small, jagged bulge along the Rhine, known as the Colmar Pocket. It was a patch of land Hitler refused to surrender. He had ordered his best men, veterans of Norway and Finland, mountain troops hardened by years of cold, to hold it to the last cartridge. Their orders were clear: stall the Allies, no matter the cost. To the Americans of the 3rd Infantry Division, it felt less like a battle and more like a slow suicide. The 15th Regiment had been fighting without rest for weeks. Snow fell, melted, and froze again, turning foxholes into coffins. Rations came late. Ammunition came light. Even the rivers seemed against them, solid sheets of ice that broke under trucks and men alike. Company B, once 187 strong, was now barely 40 effectives. The rest were gone, killed, captured, or evacuated. Frostbite took more soldiers than bullets. The men stopped shaving. They stopped joking. They just stared into the distance, waiting for the next barrage. Murphy was now their only remaining officer. He didn't complain, didn't inspire, didn't pretend. He simply moved from foxhole to foxhole, checking ammo, adjusting sight lines, patting shoulders, saying, "Keep your heads down, don't waste rounds." His face had sharpened into something almost inhuman, not cruel, but cold, forged by exhaustion and duty. The men didn't need a speech. They needed someone who wouldn't break. At dawn on the 26th of January, 1945, the world froze solid. The ground was like iron, the kind that shattered shovel blades. The air burned the lungs. Company B stretched along the edge of the Holzwehr forest, a thin tree line facing open farmland nearly a mile wide. Out there, invisible behind the mist, waited the 2nd Gebirgs Division, the German mountain troops ordered to wipe them off the map. Murphy had 2 M10 tank destroyers, old, diesel-fueled beasts with armor, too thin to survive a direct hit, and the 40 exhausted men who still followed him. That was it. No reinforcements, no promise of relief. Only a field telephone line to artillery miles behind them, his one real weapon. Around noon, the quiet broke. It started with distant thuds, the rhythm of German artillery finding its range. Then the sky cracked open. Shells exploded in the treetops, raining splinters of burning wood and steel. They weren't aiming to kill. They were aiming to terrorize. The men ducked deeper, arms over helmets. Snow turned to mud, mud turned red. For 30 minutes, the barrage didn't stop. Every blast felt like the end of the world until, suddenly, it was quiet again. Too quiet. Private Donald Ekman peeked over the trench line. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. 6 tanks, with white-painted hulls for camouflage, were advancing across the field, and behind them, like ghosts, a line of infantry stretching far beyond what any of them could count. 200? Maybe more. Later estimates said 250 German soldiers in total, all converging on their position. Murphy didn't freeze. He didn't shout. He simply lifted the field phone. "Artillery, this is Company B. Target my coordinates. Fire for effect." He could hear the disbelief on the other end. "Those are your own." "Do it," he cut in. The first shells landed hundreds of yards short, plumes of snow and dirt kicking into the air. He adjusted calmly. Up 50, left 30. But artillery alone wouldn't stop 6 tanks. He turned to his men, most of them barely standing from exhaustion. "Hold fire till they're close," he said. "Then aim for the infantry. The tanks can't kill what they can't see." Minutes crawled like hours. The tanks crept closer, tracks grinding ice. At 600 yards, the M10s opened fire. Both missed. A second later, a German 88mm round slammed into one of them. The turret went up in flame. The second M10 tried to move and slid sideways into a frozen ditch, its treads spinning uselessly. 2 shots, 2 kills, both American. Murphy stared across the field as black smoke began to rise. His company was now down to rifles, machine guns that jammed in the cold, and courage that was running out fast. The line was breaking. And that was the moment he made his decision, one that no manual, no officer, no sane soldier would ever have made. He ordered his men to fall back into the woods. Then he ran the other way, straight toward the burning M10. The air stank of diesel, smoke, and fear. The German tanks rolled forward, their guns methodical, deliberate predators stalking wounded prey. Murphy could see his own breath fogging in front of him as he sprinted through the shattered tree line. Behind him, his men hesitated, torn between obeying his order to retreat or running after him to die. He didn't look back. He knew what he was doing. The burning M10 roared like a furnace. Its steel hull glowed dull red, ammunition inside popping like distant fireworks. Every instinct screamed, "Don't go near it." But Murphy had already stopped listening to instinct years ago, when hunger had taught him that fear doesn't feed anyone. He climbed up the side armor, boots slipping on black soot, hands blistering from the heat. At the top, he found the .50 caliber Browning, the same weapon he had trained with until his fingers bled back in basic. It was hot to the touch, but still functional. He swung the heavy barrel toward the white blur advancing across the snow and pressed the trigger. The first burst tore through the German front line like a scythe. Figures dropped, snow exploded, men dove for cover that didn't exist. The noise was deafening, the deep, metallic thunder of the 50 calories echoing across the frozen fields. Each tracer line drew a scar through the smoke. From the forest behind, his men watched in disbelief. One soldier whispered, "He's firing from the damn tank." Another said nothing, just stared. They expected it to explode any second. It didn't. The thick diesel fire burned black and heavy, hiding Murphy's position inside a storm of smoke. To the Germans, it looked like the tank itself had come back to life. Murphy gritted his teeth, hands bleeding from the vibrations. The world narrowed to sights and targets, one man, one weapon, one endless swarm of enemies. He moved the gun in arcs, cutting down groups before they could regroup, adjusting by instinct like he was hunting rabbits again, only this time the stakes were human souls. His field phone dangled from his neck. Between bursts, he grabbed it with one hand, shouting coordinates over the roar. "Artillery, this is Lieutenant Murphy. Drop it 50 yards closer." Shells began falling with terrifying precision, plumes of white snow, black dirt, and orange flame rising in rhythm to his voice. Each explosion shook the tank beneath his boots. He didn't flinch. He just kept firing. The Germans tried to flank left. Murphy saw the movement, shifted his barrel, and raked the ground until bodies stopped moving. Then he spotted another group trying to crawl through a ditch on the right. One short burst ended them too. Witnesses later swore it looked inhuman, as if a machine, not a man, was behind that gun. He wasn't firing wildly. Every burst was a calculation. He was working a problem, solving it round by round. Shrapnel tore into his leg from a nearby explosion. He barely noticed. Blood soaked through his trousers, turning the snow beneath him crimson. He tightened his grip on the handles and kept going. For 40 minutes, the storm didn't stop. Machine gun bursts, artillery thunder, smoke, fire, screams. Murphy's ammunition belts ran low. He leaned down into the hatch, grabbed the last drum, fed it into the receiver, and resumed firing. The Browning slowed the barrel, glowing orange. But the Germans were still coming, closer now, some within 50 yards. He could hear their shouts, the clipped German commands echoing through the haze. They were trying to rush him, thinking the gun was nearly empty. Murphy dropped the field phone, drew his M1 carbine, and started picking them off one by one. Each shot measured, each hit final. Then came the last desperate decision, the kind that no war manual ever mentions. He grabbed the field phone again and yelled over the noise, "Fire on my position." The artillery observer refused. "Negative. You'll be caught in it." Murphy's reply was cold and sharp. "That's an order." Seconds later, the sky ripped open. Shells exploded around him, the shockwave flattening the snow, the smoke folding in on itself. German soldiers screamed as they were torn apart by the blasts. The tanks halted, disoriented, then slowly began reversing, their crews unwilling to advance into the inferno. Murphy stayed on that burning hull, surrounded by fire and falling metal, until his leg finally gave out. Then, and only then, did he slide down the side of the tank, limping back toward the tree line. Behind him, the M10 was a silhouette of ruin. 10 minutes later, it exploded a final roar that echoed through the valley. The field was littered with bodies, smoking craters, and the remains of what had been one of Hitler's elite mountain divisions. Murphy walked into the trees like a ghost returning from the grave. His men stared, unsure whether to cheer or fall silent. He just sat down on a log, bleeding, lit a cigarette, and asked, "Anybody hit?" No one answered. Because for the first time in an hour, the world was quiet again. When the smoke finally cleared, the battlefield didn't look real anymore. The snow that had been white that morning was now a canvas of black and red. Steel twisted into grotesque shapes, helmets half buried in frozen mud, rifles pointing to nowhere. The silence was so complete that Murphy thought he'd gone deaf. Only the distant crackle of the still-burning tank destroyer reminded him the world hadn't stopped. He limped back to the tree line, half dragging his wounded leg. His men stared, wide-eyed, pale, motionless, as if a ghost had walked out of the smoke. Murphy sat down on a broken log, ash falling from the cigarette, trembling in his fingers. "Status report," he said flatly. It wasn't bravado, not even exhaustion, just a soldier slipping back into the only routine he knew. Private Abramsky, still shaking, finally managed to answer. "No casualties, sir." Murphy nodded once. "Good," he muttered. "Then we hold." Across the open field, the German advance had disintegrated. Of the 250 men who began the assault, nearly half were dead or dying. The survivors' men who had fought on the frozen fronts of Norway and Finland were retreating in disorder, leaving their tanks smoldering behind them. For the first time in the war, the elite 2nd Mountain Division had been stopped not by numbers, not by armor, but by a single man with a gun and a phone. Hours later, when reinforcements arrived, they found Murphy still sitting there, uniform burned, leg bleeding, eyes distant. He hadn't moved. When an officer asked who had commanded the defense, Abramsky just pointed. "Him," he said quietly. "The lieutenant. He never left." That night, the after-action reports began circulating up the chain of command. Each one struggled to describe what had happened. There was no precedent, no military term for a man who single-handedly halted an assault of 6 tanks and hundreds of infantry. The word "impossible" appeared again and again. When the official count was made, the numbers seemed absurd. 50 German soldiers confirmed killed or wounded. 6 tanks destroyed or abandoned. Company B saved from annihilation. The division commander wrote simply, "Second Lieutenant Murphy performed beyond the limits of human capacity." But perhaps the most haunting part of the story came later, when historians searched for the German version. They combed through war diaries, division logs, and personal letters from the Colmar Pocket Campaign. Almost nothing existed for the 26th of January 1945. One vague line appeared in a regimental report. "Attack on American positions near Holzwehr, repulsed with heavy losses. Enemy resistance stronger than expected." That was it. No mention of the tanks, no record of the unit that attacked, no names of the officers involved, as if the day itself had been erased. Murphy's stand had humiliated them, not just in defeat, but in pride. The idea that 250 of Hitler's finest had been stopped by a single American teenager was a wound too deep for their doctrine to accept. Better to pretend it never happened. For the Americans, it became legend. For the Germans, it became silence. But for Murphy, it became memory. A permanent scar, burned into his mind more than his body. He would later tell a reporter, "I didn't feel brave. I just got mad watching my friends die." He had saved them, yes. But he had also watched them die for months before that day, and deep down, he knew it would never leave him. The next morning, Allied reconnaissance photographed the battlefield from the air. The images told the story better than any report. Black craters stretching across white snow, the twisted wrecks of Panzer IVs, and the outline of a single American tank destroyer still smoldering, alone at the center. From that point forward, Holzwehr became shorthand among officers for the impossible stand. New recruits whispered it like a myth, the boy who stopped an army. They never knew the smell of diesel, the sting of frozen blood, the sound of shells falling within arm's reach. But Murphy did. He heard it every night for the rest of his life. That single hour from 2:20 to 3:20 p.m. broke more than a German attack. It broke the myth of invincibility that had carried Hitler's armies since Poland. It proved that technology, numbers, and doctrine meant nothing against the raw will of one man who refused to retreat. And in doing so, it changed the trajectory of the entire campaign in Alsace, because when the Germans fell back from Holzwihr, they didn't stop until the Colmar pocket itself collapsed. The Rhine, that ancient border they had sworn to hold, would fall soon after. All because one farm boy from Texas decided that running wasn't an option. The following morning, the battlefield was a graveyard. Frozen mist drifted over the plain, wrapping the wreckage like a shroud. The snow was pitted with craters, blackened by diesel smoke and shell fire. Crows circled overhead, landing on what had once been tanks. The Americans who arrived to relieve Company B could barely believe what they saw. Everywhere, the evidence of impossible odds. 6 armored hulks scattered across 1,000 yards, empty German helmets lying like punctuation marks in the snow. And at the center of it all, the melted skeleton of an M10 tank destroyer. Its .50 caliber gun was bent, warped by heat. The firing grips were fused, as if the weapon itself had tried to keep shooting until it burned out. In the snow nearby were the imprints of boots, one pair, leading away toward the woods. When the news spread through the division, disbelief turned into awe. Soldiers repeated the story in half-whispers, a lieutenant who'd fought alone for an hour, a man who'd called artillery on his own position. Some called it suicide. Others called it a miracle. Murphy didn't call it anything. He refused interviews. When pressed by officers, he just said, "I had no choice." His commander's report read like fiction. Lieutenant Murphy remained at his post, directing artillery and firing a .50 caliber machine gun at close range, repelling repeated enemy assaults. His actions inflicted heavy casualties and forced the withdrawal of superior enemy forces. But the numbers didn't explain the magnitude. 50 Germans dead or wounded. An entire company shattered. An attack that should have crushed the line erased by one man's defiance. The Germans, meanwhile, left almost nothing behind. Their diaries went quiet that week. Reports from the 2nd Mountain Division listed unexpected resistance and severe losses. That was all. No mention of the tank destroyer. No note of the American lieutenant. Historians later combed the archives in Freiburg, Berlin, even Oslo, where remnants of the division were transferred after the war. The result was the same: silence. It wasn't oversight, it was shame. For a force trained to believe in superiority, to be broken by a single boy was a wound too deep to record. They deleted it from their history, but that silence became its own confession. In March 1945, the Colmar pocket collapsed. The German line west of the Rhine disintegrated. Within weeks, 50,000 Axis troops surrendered or were cut off. For Allied commanders, Holzwihr was the spark that turned stalemate into breakthrough. For the men who had fought there, it was just survival. They didn't talk about strategy. They talked about the cold, the noise, and the figure they'd seen standing on top of a burning tank alone. When General Alexander Patch pinned the Medal of Honor to Murphy's chest later that year, the ceremony was brief. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty." Those words had been used before, but never for something like Holzwihr. It wasn't a victory of technology or tactics. It was the victory of will. Photographs from that day show Murphy standing ramrod straight, eyes hollow, face expressionless. Reporters asked what went through his mind when he climbed that tank. He answered softly, "They were killing my friends. Somebody had to stop them." That was all he ever said. No talk of heroism. No self-mythologizing. Just a statement of duty, raw, simple, and final. The war still raged in Europe, but for Murphy, something fundamental had already ended on that field. He had faced the impossible and survived it, and deep inside, a part of him knew that nothing afterward would ever feel truly alive again. The defense of Holzweiler did more than save a company, it shifted an entire front. In the days that followed, Allied intelligence intercepted frantic German messages. Units retreating, positions abandoned, orders lost in confusion. The once feared Colmar pocket, that last German hold in France, began to collapse. Murphy's stand had bought time, but more than that, it had shattered morale. The 2nd Mountain Division, veterans of campaigns from Norway to Italy, had never met resistance like this. They withdrew in disorder, leaving their equipment, their wounded, and their pride scattered across the snow. Within a week, the French First Army linked with the U.S. 7th, sealing the pocket for good. 50,000 Axis troops were trapped and forced to surrender. The Rhine, the river Hitler called Germany's shield, now lay open. And the final road to the heart of the Reich began with one man who refused to step back. In April, as the campaign in Europe drew to its close, Murphy was summoned to division headquarters. He thought it was for another debriefing. Instead, a colonel handed him a paper, his name printed at the top in bold type, Recommendation Medal of Honor. Murphy stared at it in silence. The officer said, "You earned it, son." He only answered, "I just did my job." 2 months later, in Salzburg, Austria, under a pale spring sky, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch pinned the medal to his tunic. A military band played softly. Reporters flashed bulbs. But the recipient looked distant, detached. The official citation read, "He was alone and exposed to German fire from 3 sides. Yet his deadly fire killed dozens of enemy soldiers and caused their attack to waver. For 1 hour, the enemy tried every available weapon to eliminate 2nd Lieutenant Murphy, but he continued to hold his position." History would condense that hour into those few sterile lines. It couldn't capture the smoke, the screams, or the boy who stood on a burning tank and made himself the line. That medal made him the most decorated American soldier of the war. It made him a national hero, and at the same time, it ended his anonymity forever. From that moment on, the world would know his name. But the man behind the name, the 19-year-old who had seen too much, was about to face a war no medal could ever win. When the guns of Europe finally went silent in May 1945, the soldiers who survived expected peace. They went home, built lives, tried to forget. But for Audie Murphy, silence was the enemy. He had lived too long inside the noise. At first, the world celebrated him. His face appeared on magazine covers. He shook hands with generals, presidents, movie stars. The newspapers called him the one-man army. America loved him because he represented something pure: courage, sacrifice, the boy who had beaten the odds. But behind the cameras, Murphy couldn't sleep. The war followed him into every dark room. He saw the firelight of Holzweiler every time he closed his eyes. He woke up gasping for air, hand reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. He moved to Hollywood because they told him he could start over. He smiled when they offered him movie roles. He learned his lines. He stood on film sets surrounded by lights, but inside, he was still on that frozen field in Alsace, still hearing the metallic hammer of the 50 cal, still calling fire on his own position. Doctors called it battle fatigue. The Army called it nerves. Today we call it PTSD. Murphy didn't have words for it, only symptoms. Insomnia, nightmares, sudden bursts of rage or fear. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow, because the dark reminded him of patrols that ended in blood. Sometimes his friends found him pacing the hallway at 3 a.m., barefoot, whispering names men long dead. He tried therapy, tried pills, tried pretending. Nothing worked. He told one reporter, "I can't remember a night without nightmares. They're part of me now." Fame only made it worse. Every interview, every parade, every speech dragged the ghosts back into daylight. He hated being called a hero. He said it made him feel like a liar. "Hero," he told one journalist. "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back." By the early 1952, his marriage was cracking under the pressure. He had money, fame, success, and yet he couldn't find peace. He isolated himself, drank too much coffee, refused to talk about the war. When asked to describe Holtzwehr, he just shook his head. "There's nothing to tell," he said. "You had to be there." His friends noticed the scars that didn't bleed, the sudden stillness, the way he froze at fireworks, the way he flinched when doors slammed. Some nights he moved to the garage to sleep, lights on, gun beside him. Because darkness wasn't rest, it was memory. In 1951, he met Pamela Archer, a young airline stewardess. She saw through the medals and the movie posters, saw the fractures he tried to hide. They married that same year. For a while, she gave him something no battlefield ever could: quiet. But the nightmares didn't stop. Pamela learned to live with them, the shouting, the pacing, the fear. Sometimes she would wake to find him sitting on the edge of the bed, drenched in sweat, eyes wide open, whispering orders to invisible soldiers. She never ran. She stayed. Murphy began speaking publicly about what he was going through. It was the early 1960s, a time when mental health was taboo, and veterans were expected to stay silent. But he didn't care about stigma anymore. He wrote, "What about the soldier who can't sleep? What about the one who can't forget?" He became one of the first public advocates for veterans' mental health, long before the term PTSD existed. He used his platform to fight for others who were living with invisible wounds. In his own quiet way, he was still on the front line this time, against a different kind of enemy. He had faced tanks, artillery, and death without blinking. But now he was fighting the one enemy he couldn't outshoot: his own memories. And like the battle at Holtzwehr, it was a war he fought alone. When Audie Murphy's plane went down in the mountains of Virginia on the 28th of May, 1971, America mourned a legend. He was 45 years old. He had survived 6 campaigns, 3 wounds, and more than 20 major battles, only to die in peacetime, in bad weather, on a civilian flight. His funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew thousands. Men who had once fought beside him stood silent as the rifles fired their salute. The Medal of Honor gleamed one last time against the flag that covered his coffin. The inscription on the headstone was simple: Audie L. Murphy, Texas, Medal of Honor, America's most decorated soldier. To the public, that was the end of the story. To Pamela Murphy, it was only the beginning. In the weeks after his death, she discovered the reality her husband had left behind: debts, bad investments, unpaid bills. The Hollywood fame that had once seemed permanent had vanished overnight. There were no book royalties waiting, no secret savings. She was 50, a widow with 2 teenage sons and almost nothing. Friends expected her to write a tell-all memoir or sell his medals. She did neither. Instead, she walked into the Sepulveda Veterans Affairs Hospital in Los Angeles and asked for a job, not as an administrator, not as a figurehead, just as a clerk, a patient liaison, a quiet desk in the corner of a noisy hallway. That first morning, she wore a simple gray suit and pinned a small photograph of Audie to the side of her cubicle. When veterans came in broken, confused, angry at a system that kept losing their files, she listened. When bureaucracy stalled their benefits, she made calls until someone answered. When a doctor refused to see a patient, she walked into his office and didn't leave until he did. They called her Mrs. Murphy, never the Mrs. Murphy. Most of them didn't even realize who she was, and she never told them. She didn't need recognition. She had already lived through fame, and she knew how hollow it was. Year after year, she kept coming back. The decades changed. The wars changed. Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, but the broken men walking through those hospital doors looked the same. Pamela saw her husband's face in all of them, the same haunted eyes, the same restless hands. She told one nurse, "If I can help one of them sleep through the night, I've done my job." Her persistence became legendary. Paperwork that once took months vanished from her desk in days. She fought lost checks, missing records, and cold bureaucracy with the same quiet fury her husband had once used on the battlefield. They began calling her the Field Sergeant of the VA. For 35 years, she served veterans every day, until she finally retired in 2007 at 87 years old. When she passed away in 2010, the obituaries didn't lead with her husband's name. They led with hers. The Los Angeles Times wrote, "Pamela Murphy didn't just preserve Audie's memory, she extended it. For decades, she was the soldier's soldier, the advocate every veteran wished they had. She was buried beside him at Arlington. Two graves, side by side, the warrior and the healer, the mechanic and the pilot, the man who fought for his friends, and the woman who spent a lifetime fighting for his. Together they represent the two halves of courage, the kind that stands on a burning tank under fire, and the kind that stands in a bureaucratic hallway for 35 years, refusing to give up on the forgotten. The guns of World War II have long been silent, but the echo of their story still carries, because real heroism doesn't end with medals or victory. Sometimes it begins afterward, in the quiet places where someone decides that compassion is just another way to keep fighting.